So now we're able to update individual tracks, and that's great. However, you might have noticed a problem, particularly if you have tracks from multiple users. What we're doing is we're providing the update track component to every single track, whether or not a given authenticated user was the one who created the track. Obviously, we only want the ability the component that we want to pass the data, the state from. So let's start in root, and we use context by first creating it. So we create it with the help of our React import. So right above our root component, we can say react.createContext. So when we call createContext on React, we get an object returned to us that gives us two things, a provider and a consumer. But instead of destructuring context into its individual properties, we're going to put it on an object, or keep these values on an object that we call useContext. And to use context throughout our application, we need to export it. So we'll add the export keyword before our useContext declaration. So first, after creating context and making it available to other components, we want to take the data that we're interested in passing down, namely current user, and provide it. We want to provide it to our component tree. And for that, we use our provider. So in place of our React fragments, we can just add useContext. And remember, this is just an object. So we can say useContext.provider. We'll add a set of useContext.provider tags. And again, we want to pass down our current user, and the data that we want to pass down is provided on a value prop. So we add value to our provider and put current user on it. Next, we can head to the component where we want to receive this data, where we want to receive current user. As we already mentioned, that will be update track. And the very first thing that we need to do here, no matter what, when we're using context, no matter what pattern we're using, we need to import that context that we're exporting from root. So whenever we want to consume the data that was passed down from our provider, we need to import the context that was created. So we'll import user context from // root. Now there are a number of ways to consume context, so to speak, to get our data that we're passing down, current user. The first and older approach is to use the render props pattern. So we could potentially head down to our return JSX, and wrap everything in user context dot consumer. We could add a set of those tags. And just like all of our query and mutation components, the consumer by default uses a render props pattern. So we'd have to create a function, take all of our JSX, put it within the function, and within the parameters we get access to current user because we provided it on value. And then of course we can use current user wherever we like. However, I personally don't recommend this pattern since we can use a special React hook that makes consuming context a lot easier than render props, since our component structure, I believe, is already a bit confusing with just one or two render props components. Instead of using user context.consumer, we'll turn these back to simple fragments, we can use a special hook called useContext. So as we've seen before, hooks are executed up at the top of our component. So in order to use context, and we can put it above all of our use state calls, useContext takes the entire context object that we imported, and then it immediately returns to us the data that we put on the value prop. So right here we can just declare current user. And we can confirm this with a simple console log. So if we save root and update track, we can see in fact that our current user is being passed down to our update track component. So now we can do what we need with it. To compare our current user's ID with the ID on posted by, we can create a variable called isCurrentUser that'll be either true or false, or we can check to see if currentUser.id is equal to track.postedby.id. Then to be able to hide this entire component, we can add right after the return keyword, but before the parentheses, isCurrentUser. And if that evaluates to true, we'll use an AND operator to then return all of our markup. So now let's save update track. And when our page reloads, we should see that for a track that another user's created other than the one that we're authenticated with, update track goes away. But for the tracks that we have created, we can still edit them. So this is how you use React context in conjunction with the useContext hook in order to pass data state values down our component tree without having to resort to props drilling and without having to bring in a complex state management system like Redux, which often includes a lot of boilerplate code.